Hey everybody, how's it going? Dr. Asanalu here. Let's commence with the final unit of this whirlwind tour of recent moral issues in the summer of 2022. Today's unit, which is on racism and white privilege, especially institutionalized racism, it's going to be a nice way to synthesize everything I've been trying to do in our short amount of time together. I think, for example, Yancy's piece is a great way to highlight what I want the course to be about, which is about you developing your own point of view so that you figure out what you're going to do about all these issues. And I'll end the unit and the video with that discussion. But we'll also see that institutionalized racism is the sort of underlying rot behind all of the issues that we've talked about so far. The women's rights, gun rights, the abuse of free speech. It all traces back in a very, very real, very, very straightforward way to white patriarchy and the deep-seated racism that is part of American culture and American history, which we need to face up to. Otherwise, it's just going to keep getting worse. Okay? And you'll see that in various ways throughout this, how it sort of synthesizes things I've been saying. And it's going to be another version of what I hope is this kind of unit, whereby we all agree on the existence of the problem of institutionalized racism, but you can do that and disagree about how exactly to solve it. So I'm going to also say a couple of things about that, and you're going to give your point of view, especially on the discussion forum post, regarding how you think institutionalized racism ought to be solved. And it's going to relate to your views on a certain form of affirmative action. So that's coming, but yeah, it bears mentioning that you do live in a intellectual landscape right now whereby people deny the existence of institutionalized racism. And you're going to see that those are examples of the kind of cowards that Yancy was trolling if you paid attention to his piece that he wrote. So the starting point is that it does exist. And what I'll do today is I'll try to give you the facts to back that up. So I shouldn't say it's a starting point because I'm going to actually defend it with evidence as to why institutionalized racism exists. I imagine I'm going to say a lot of things that you've heard before, but I suspect that some of the stuff I say you might not have heard, which would make this unit potentially useful. And so the idea is you'd be able to respond to people who want to deny the existence of this stuff, and you'll see how, unfortunately, the same kind of thing that I'm talking about contextualizes everything that's happening today. I'll just say a little bit about that. I mean, the murder of George Floyd was a flashpoint that sort of galvanized people to address systemic racism in policing practices. It's unfortunately still occurring. Nothing has been done at the institutional level to address it. Everyone just wants to keep pretending that it's just going to go away on its own, and it's getting worse. I mean, there was a 13-year-old boy who was shot in the spine recently in Chicago. The video of him, with his hands up didn't prevent the police from doing that. Okay. You had the Buffalo massacre recently, very clearly racially motivated. He drove to that supermarket knowing it was predominantly frequented by black and brown folks. You have a Mississippi man recently executed. It was repeated offenses, but the latest offense was drug possession. But he was upheld by Mississippi law that he should be executed, and Supreme Court of Mississippi didn't think that they should make an exception to him. One can only wonder if they would say the same thing if it was a white person. You can't prove that, but it certainly fits a pattern. Okay. So what is the history that contextualizes this, again, all too recent and disturbing moral issue? And it's can start, obviously, I don't need to say it, right, with respect to slavery. The institution of slavery in the U.S. was unique in history in the industry of it. I mean, plenty of societies have had slaves, but oftentimes it's slaves that they get by, say, conquering people. But the slave trade was a systematic attempt to commodify a living person, and that existed for several hundred years, as you know, since around 1619 is usually when people say that it started. And with the Civil War being fought over slavery and the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 on January 1st, just read that to my kid as a refresher, right? And the Civil War and the Confederacy surrendering in 1865, you have this new era, and it's known as the sort of era of Reconstruction, which is usually from 1865 to 1876. And that coincides with something called the Jim Crow era, which many people date from the end of the Civil War, 1865, all the way up until the Civil Rights Movement of 1964, 1965, and 1968, where you had things like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act passed, Fair Housing Act, things like that. So the thing I wanted to talk about vis-a-vis the institutional nature of racism were the Jim Crow laws, which, again, the Jim Crow era can just be, roughly speaking, from the end of the Civil War up until the Civil Rights Movement, Civil Rights Act of 1964, 1968, however you want to, mark it off there. But these were laws, right, designed to disenfranchise and segregate black folks to make sure that they did not get the equal rights that were ostensibly given to them as a result of the ending of the Civil War. The initial end of the Civil War presented a lot of great promise for black people because of the passing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, roughly speaking from 1865 to 1870, 13th Amendment ending slavery, 14th and 15th Amendment giving black men equal rights and the explicit ability to vote, okay? And as a result of those practices, especially in the South, you had so-called Jim Crow laws, sometimes they're called the Black Codes, that wanted to reverse all of that promise and undermine any attempt to give black people rights in this country. And it persists to this day. So what's the best way to sort of understand Jim Crow laws? I mean, in preparing for this, I thought of putting it under 4 different headings. There's voting, there's employment, there's education, and then there's social practices. Okay? And you'll see that theme sort of relates to what I'm going to talk about next, which is all the brutality that came with these laws. And it also relates to how Jim Crow laws persist to this day, which is the next thing I'm going to talk about in the next slide. So let's start with voting, right? The way that mostly southern states did this to get around the express federal ability for black people to vote was to put in all these restrictions that had the effect of disenfranchising them. There is, for example, the literacy tests that they performed. These literacy tests were performed in a double standard way, whereas if a white person registered to vote, they gave them a literacy test of like a children's book or something easy like that. And if a black person registered to vote in a lot of southern states, they gave them like a very, very difficult legal text, say, that was hard to decipher as their literacy tests. And so they failed them for that and wouldn't allow them to vote for that reason. Very racist, openly racist, double standard written into the law. They also had property requirements, right? Which, as we'll talk about, was something that disenfranchised black people because they were never given the opportunity to gain property after becoming free. And that was also explicit in institutional ways I'll discuss. There's the so-called grandfather clause. You may have heard of this idea of being grandfathered into something. Well, this stems from this racist practice where they said you can vote as long as your grandfather had the ability to vote. And of course, newly freed slaves, their grandfathers were slaves, so they were not able to vote. And so it goes, a whole bunch of different practices designed to prevent black people from voting in the South were implemented. And we'll talk about the more violent ways that they were discouraged from voting next. That's what this one, which I have highlighted. Right now, of course, I'm talking about these examples, just to be clear. All right, so you have examples of voting. Then you have, we can talk about employment next, right? So after the end of the Civil War, a explicit attempt was made to give black people property. In other words, like a government implemented way of giving them property. And the reason that you would need that is beyond obvious. If you talk about, say, equal opportunity, right, then you need to have in mind where people start. So the fact is, you and I do not have the same opportunities as like a celebrity's family or a celebrity does, right? So a celebrity's kid has a starting point that's very different than you and I or a poorer person, right? And so black people were recently given freedom, right? But it wasn't like as soon as they were given freedom, they were offered a level playing field. And what happened was Lincoln was assassinated, of course, and his successor, the Vice President Andrew Johnson, was, a racist, born in Tennessee, and he didn't believe in a lot of the things that Lincoln believed in, and he wasn't as much of a champion for black civil rights. And so he believed that rather than having a federal program that gave black people property, gave them land, he assumed that all they needed to do was give them sharecropping, it was called. Okay, and sharecropping is a sort of remnant of the feudal era, basically, with respect to peasants who work the land, whereby, freed slaves were offered the opportunity to work on a plantation or former plantation, farm it. They would get a share of the crops. They did not own the crops. They did not own the land, but they would get a wage and some shares and some of the food as compensation. Okay, and so that's what was offered for them. As you might imagine, the drawing up of the sharecropper contracts were racist and unfair. They would make it so that, for example, the slaves started off in debt to, say, a former plantation owner, and they would arrange it so that the contracts and the wages would make it so that it would be impossible for them to ever repay the debt. So they would be effectively indentured servants and stay on that land and never actually be able to own any land for themselves. There was, something like 90% of freed slaves lived in the South and stayed in the South. That's where they were from. That's where they grew up, and that's where they stayed. And as a result of these and other practices I'm about to mention, only 1%, about 3,000 of them, owned land. So hardly a level playing field at all to start off with. The same sort of discrimination was found in hiring practices and businesses practices more generally. Here's where you get the more familiar forms of segregation, right? Black people and white people weren't allowed always to work in the same room. They often had to use different entrances, and woven into the hiring practices were the racism of the people doing the hiring, which were often white people who didn't think black people could be trusted as workers. That sort of thing happened too. Segregated hiring practices were part of the Jim Crow South, and discrimination towards black people was of a piece of that. The next pillar of the four I mentioned, education. Education was another form of segregation. There was a difference between black schools and white schools. And as you might imagine, white schools were of much better quality, much better funded than black schools. This is not that difficult to understand because people in power realize that the way that you actually empower a group of people politically is you educate them. And they knew that the opposite of that meant that if we wanted to keep them oppressed, we need to keep them uneducated. I mean, this ran through the history of slavery. Slaves were highly discouraged from learning to read and write. Some of them were punished if they found out that they could read or write, sometimes by death. And that's because the slave owners knew that an educated group of slaves was a danger to their power, and so they tried to keep them uneducated. And that persisted in the practices of the Jim Crow South, and you can see it woven into how they ran education in that segregated, double standard fashion. Okay, and then the last of the pillars that I talked about, just social practices. These are the more familiar forms of segregation that you probably already learned about, right? Separate water fountains, separate restaurants, and things like that, right? So the whole idea of a whites-only place of business is of a piece with this form of segregation. And here's where the Supreme Court makes its first appearance in this video, and I reinforce how the Supreme Court is a partisan body that upholds a lot of the problems, because in 1896, this is the famous Plessy versus Ferguson decision, whereby segregation was upheld by that conservative court. And that's where you get this notion of separate but equal, right? But everybody knew that it was separate, but it sure as heck wasn't equal. Okay, and so that's the Jim Crow laws, just very, very briefly. And what I want to also talk about next is the just violent, brutal, disgusting reaction to emancipation and the political empowerment of black people that resulted mostly in the South, not completely in the South, okay, but mostly in the South. I'm going to give you a link to the Equal Justice Initiative, where a lot of what I say throughout this whole video, frankly, is talked about in great detail. It's what I read prior to preparing for this video. I will say that it was very disheartening and very depressing to read it. So I would set aside a couple hours to read it, but I would be prepared to just be disgusted. So what I'd like to talk about now, that you can find in that Equal Justice Initiative pamphlet that I'll show you, is this violent reaction to the Reconstruction era. So the Reconstruction era, as I mentioned, began right after the end of the Civil War, and it's usually said to last, until 1876. And it was the explicit attempt of the U.S. government to empower politically black people. And it involved, not only the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, but the enforcement of them by federal troops after the Civil War. And the reaction to those laws is one of the darkest eras of American history. So I wouldn't be surprised if you don't know a great deal about it. Maybe you do. But the reason why you don't know a great deal about it is it's, equivalent to the Nazi Holocaust and that sort of thing. It's very disgusting what went on. I'll give you just a sort of a broad overview of it to start. In that 12-year span ish, right? The number of documented killings of black people was 2,000. Okay. And in the period, 70-year-ish period from 1870 all the way up to 1854, the same amount or the same documentation took place, and it was 4,400. So you have 2,000 in the span of 12 years and 4,400 in the span of about 70 years. Needless to say, that's just documented. And so it's without a doubt much, much more than that. Part of the reason is because of the press, especially the Southern press, being complicit, right? Not reporting a lot of things, underplaying a lot of things, pretending it wasn't there, right? In a variety of ways. So the press and the propaganda system in this country, that's another video which we won't be able to have, but they played a crucial and complicit role in all of this, as they do to this day. So what went on? Well, all of the things that I talked about, the four headings, they were undermined in a similar but a violent fashion, a brutal, terrorizing fashion, right? And I'll just say out of the gate, almost zero prosecution, almost zero enforcement. A lot of times the police were complicit in carrying out these brutal acts, okay? Lynchings, rape, shootings, beatings, public disparagement, okay? Just a whole bunch of disgusting acts throughout this period in particular, okay? So let's start with voting. There's just a bunch of documented massacres that took place. Opelousas, Louisiana, Memphis, Tennessee, Milliken, Texas. The Equal Justice Initiative documents 34 massacres throughout this period, where in this case it's defined as a systematic killing of black people and those who supported them. And in the ones that I mentioned, it got into the hundreds. And again, it's hard to actually know the actual number given all of the issues with reporting. But, I mean, the details are, just very, very difficult. And some of the graphic details I will not get into just because it pisses me off so much. And I hope you read it just so you don't shy away from our history. Okay? But raping, murdering, brutality towards people just for voting, just for registering to vote, just for running for office, just for participating in the political process, just for organizing, just for trying to empower themselves as citizens of this country. The white mobs, mostly of white men, okay, were not having it, okay, and they did everything they could in all sorts of atrocious ways, disgusting ways, to make sure that black people did not participate politically, so that they did not gain the power that way. As a result, I mean, in the beginning, right after the Civil War, around 1868, 80% of black men were registered to vote. 80%. Okay, by the end of this era, something like 1% registered to vote. So they were decimated politically as a result of these disgusting practices. And I'm just going to leave it at that. The details are important, and I hope you do read that pamphlet by the Equal Justice Initiative to become educated of just how depraved our country's history is, because you need to learn it. Okay, the same sorts of things, all sorts of atrocious things were done with respect to employment. Okay, a great example is when a black person was not given their wages, their sharecropping wages, and they complained about it, they were beaten, sometimes killed. So all of the disgusting, violent things I mentioned that suppressed them in terms of political participation also kept their wages down. Okay, so they were not given the opportunity to gain any wealth as a result of the institutions in this country in the form of the laws, and as a result of the white male mob, racist intimidation that resulted, whereby they were beaten for, say, asking for a fairer deal. Okay, education, same thing. Violent, disgusting behavior done to make sure that black people remain uneducated. The examples that are most salient here is the sort of systematic burning of black schools to make sure that they didn't have a place to become educated. Lawless, but very systematic, happened quite often in the South, went completely unpunished. Okay? And then the last heading, the social practices, those social norms that were, of a piece with segregation, they were also enforced with the same brutality. If a black person looked at a white person, especially a white woman, in the wrong way, they were beaten, sometimes killed as a result. If they one black man was killed because he didn't tip his hat at a white man passing by, right? So all of the familiar forms of segregation that you know about they were also enforced in that same kind of social segregation was enforced in the brutal ways that I mentioned. Killing, beatings, whippings, lynchings, okay, being burned at the stake. I didn't talk about that. That was very common all throughout this period and continuing in many respects up until today. Okay. So what I wanted to then talk about was today, and that does sort of bring us to the present day. And, I hope that you are not naive in thinking that with the civil rights movement of the 1960s, that institutionalized forms of racism just went away. And I'll prove to you why that hasn't happened. And I think you should recognize how there's a continuity between our racist past, especially but not completely in the South, okay, leading up until today. The reason why there would be continuity is not hard to understand, okay? Just as you are not separable from your development, in that the way that you are now is certainly a product of your upbringing, our racist institutions, right, that we began with, I mean, this country is founded on genocide and slavery. There is a continuity between them and the things I mentioned already. The killing in Buffalo, for example. Certainly the January 6th coup attempt. That has great continuity with our racist past, given that it's was perpetrated by hate groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. And again, I hope you're watching those hearings right now so that you are aware of just how brazen and ridiculous that coup attempt was. But it's contextualized by our past. I mean, the analogy is a tree, right? And we are sort of the latest outgrowth of the tree, a little branch. But if you go back to our past, you get to the trunk. And what I've been describing so far is the trunk. And you cannot escape that. If you pretend like it's not there, you are naive. Okay? So how were the Jim Crow laws, how are they practiced today? Let's just go through the major four headings, right? Voting rights. I mean, the latest example of how voting rights have been restricted for black people is the 2013 decision of, you guessed it, the Supreme Court, which gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What it did, this was a decision that got rid of so-called preclearance. And what preclearance was a requirement that any state, say a southern state, that made changes to its voting regulations, they had to submit those changes to the Justice Department, the Civil Rights Department of the Civil Rights Wing of the Justice Department, to make sure that it didn't result in discrimination. So that requirement for preclearance was rescinded in 2013. In the decision from the Justice, I can't remember if it was Scalia or Roberts, but it sounds like Scalia, is the idea is, or what they said explicitly is, well, racism's over. We don't really need to do this anymore. Okay. So as a result of that, 2013, right, a whole bunch of racist practices in voting have been given rise to. 1700, for example, 1700-ish, 1688, I think, if I remember just briefly, I looked at it right before I started this. Polling places have been closed since 2013. Most of them in Texas, all right, and a lot of them in other southern states. And they were all polling places that were frequented by black people. So the idea is it makes it harder for black people to vote if they have to drive, say, a couple hours in some cases to do so when they also have to work, right? So the closing of polling stations is another example. Voter ID laws. These are known to be disproportionately affecting people of color and acts as a way of disenfranchising them. There's studies that show that voter ID restrictions that were in place prior to the 2016 election, won the election for Trump. Okay, good example of this, you can look this up, is in Wisconsin. Trump won Wisconsin by something like 27,000 votes. The voter ID law that was put in place for the 2016 election had a huge effect on voter turnout in, say, Milwaukee County, which is predominantly black and one of the more predominantly black areas of Wisconsin. And there's an estimate that it depressed the vote by something like 41,000. Okay, so if those 41,000 people had voted, there's a good chance that Trump would not have won Wisconsin. He would not have become president. Okay, so that disenfranchisement has real effects that we are sort of reverberating to this day. Okay, and so though that's just one example, the voter ID laws and the closing of polling stations, that's a modern day form of the Jim Crow era. Employment practices. I mean, let's start to talk about wealth, because when I talked about employment, that related to wealth, and they're obviously intertwined. Well, we already talked about how black people were not given property to start off, and they were explicitly denied it in a way that made it so that very few of them owned land in the South as a result of these racist sharecropping deals, right? Well, that didn't improve throughout history, and it became enshrined actually in our federal government after the New Deal, with respect to institutions like the Federal Housing Administration and other government bodies, which wrote into federal law, I mean, it's explicit in federal law, that you do not subsidize housing for black people. So they had New Deal programs that provided government housing in the form that you're more familiar with, right? Free housing, basically. And they gave free housing to white people, and they gave free housing to black people, and they made sure that they segregated the neighborhoods in question. And they encouraged developers to build in a way that segregated in that fashion as well. Right? And they made better houses for white people and worse houses for black people. This was explicit. And also the Federal Housing Administration explicitly said, we will only insure houses in certain neighborhoods. So this is, you may have heard of this, maybe you haven't. But if you haven't, you'll hear this word a lot. It's called redlining. It comes from a explicit practice by the federal government, the Federal Housing Administration, where they would have maps, and they would mark off the maps according to places where they said, well, here's where you should insure the loans federally, right? And here's where you shouldn't. And the places that they shouldn't were blocked off areas that were predominantly blacked, and they were blocked off in red. And so that's where the term redlining is. So it was written into these practices, written into a handbook, for example, that you shouldn't give loans to certain areas that created, quote, racial disharmony. Right, which was an explicit way of saying don't give loans to black people, right? And as a result of that went on all the way up, and there was the Fair Housing Act of 1965. But as you might imagine, it persists to this day. The idea that you can make laws is one thing, right? But the behavior of the lenders and the people that help the lenders, as the institutions making the money, that's another thing, right? You can have all the laws in the world, if they're not enforced, or if human behavior acts differently, then they won't achieve their desired effect, and they're not achieving their desired effect. It's just well known that a black person has much more difficulty getting a loan than a white person. Predatory lending is a very common practice. So you can see it as of a piece with redlining. What happened was, if you were in a poorer neighborhood and you wanted a house, you couldn't get a federally insured loan, right? You certainly couldn't get well subsidized in government housing, like good government housing. You get the projects, okay, but you couldn't get a good piece of government housing. So they were desperate for loans, and lenders knew that. And so predatory lending says, well, I'll give you a loan, and here are the conditions. And sound familiar? Like the sharecropping contracts? They gave them crappy loans, ridiculous interest rates, all sorts of traps to make sure that they would fleece them for as much money as possible, right? And they wouldn't allow them to actually gain the wealth. Okay, and so that's predatory lending is of a piece with redlining in that respect. It's a sort of symptom of it. Well, that goes on to this day. Predatory lending towards black people goes on to this day. It's part of the 2008 financial crisis, which I won't get into. They've shown that Facebook does this. Facebook allows loaning agencies, right, to target their ads in a way that targets ads so that good loans are given to white people and bad loans are given to black people. And this happens even to this day. And they, try to get around it and say like they have nothing to do with it. But Facebook knows exactly what it's doing when it allows people to advertise in a way that targets things accordingly. So those, all the stuff related to housing and employment, that persists to this day. Needless to say, all the racist, forms of employment also apply. I mean, there's a lot to talk about here. I just was talking about housing since it relates to wealth. But hiring practices, they've done studies that if you have two resumes, they're identical, except for the only difference is at the top you have a white-sounding name, and the other one you have a black-sounding name. Who do you think's getting the interview? Okay, it's been shown. The racial biases show up in hiring practices. Okay. So that persists to this day. Education. All right. We all know that we have different forms of education for people of color in inner cities. This is an explicit practice whereby the amount of funding that goes to a school is a function of property taxes. So if you're in a wealthy neighborhood, you have a house that's worth a lot, you're going to pay a lot in property taxes. As a result of that, you're going to have a well-funded school. Poorer areas with less property taxes means less money for schools. Well, that money goes into the education of people of color, and as a result, they get a less quality education, right? And all the social practices to this day, right, they apply as well. Right, all of the sort of the modern ways in which black people are treated differently, they're well known. Okay, so let's get into some other related areas that sort of maybe they don't map onto the four areas as well, but they're relevant. I mean, the most obvious one is the criminal justice system. We have a two-tier justice system. If you want a summation of this, I'm sure some of you have seen this, but you want to watch the video 13th. I'm sure you can still find it on Netflix. Again, watch it, but you're going to have to steel yourself to sit through it because it's just disgusting. You do need to watch it if you have not watched it. And it's called 13th because it surrounds this idea that the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, except there was a clause that said unless they're, incriminated, basically. Okay. And so, white Southerners, plantation owners saw a loophole in the 13th Amendment right away, whereby they said, well, if they're convicted of crimes, I can enslave them and have the effect of slavery that way. This started right off in the Jim Crow South, just to go back to that with so-called convict leasing, and where convict leasing was, first of all, you incriminate a black person for a crime in a sort of unjust way, right? For ridiculous reasons, right? And then you imprison them, and then convict leasing says, well, as part of your sentence, you're going to have to go work on this plantation. And a lot of times they would work for the same people that they were enslaved by prior to the end of the Civil War, except now they're doing it as convicts. And the government did this explicitly to give those plantation owners that free labor, since they couldn't get the free labor in the form of slavery anymore. And that process leads all the way up to today in ways that movie talks about. I mean, and it relates very much to policing. I mean, policing was a racist institution from the start. Policing began in the South as a way of returning escaped slaves. That's the start of the police system. And all of the things I mentioned about the post-Reconstruction era, the police were complicit in that. They knew exactly what the white mobs were doing, and they looked the other way. Sometimes they actively participated in the lynchings. Okay, and policing to this day is very much racist in sort of obvious ways. There's a endemic form of white nationalism in policing. You can look at this. There's a disproportionate amount of white nationalists in that are members of the police. Okay, so there's something about being in the police which attracts racists, and they are trained in racist ways that reinforce all of these problematic forms of treatment. I mean, you've seen it. You've seen how they handle a white man with a gun versus a black man with a gun. I don't need to talk about the countless forms of murder that we all see on tape. I gave you the most recent example of that 13-year-old in Chicago. Still goes on, and it's of a piece with these racist post-Reconstruction era practices. Again, if you want to deny that, then you're denying that the branch has a trunk attached to it. It's an outgrowth of it. You can do that. You can deny it, but you're denying reality. You're denying the development of this country if you do that. That relates also, as you know, to sentencing. I just gave you the example of the Mississippi man who was sentenced to death for his repeated offense for a drug crime, right? It's been proven that white people have much more lenient forms of sentences, right? Cash bail. This is another racist practice because cash bail says if you got the money, you can get out of jail. Obviously, if you're a poorer folk and you haven't been given that leg up for all the reasons I talked about, then you don't have the money for cash bail. Well, then they languish in prison sometimes for years before actually coming to trial. Okay, so those are some examples of racism in our criminal justice system. Talked about it in education. Healthcare is another example of modern forms of racism. For example, way that doctors treat black women has been documented. The black mortality rate of pregnant women is much higher than for white women. For whatever reason, I should say for racist reasons, doctors tend to ignore the pain of black women. This has been shown. Okay, so that survives to this day. Okay, on and on I could go. I mean, there's a whole class worth of detail to be gotten into with respect to this issue. Stop and frisk, I didn't even mention that. That goes back to policing. But you should become educated with respect to this stuff, and you should know how the racist past that we've had in all the institutions, they have a very, very real effect on what is going on right now. The hate groups, right, that were spawned, I'll just end with this, by this response. You can think about the Ku Klux Klan, right, as the sort of shining example of the hate group. That was formed in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865 by 6 Confederate soldiers. And it took off. It had its peak in 1920. There was about 4 million members of the KKK in the 1920s. That's when it peaked. And, that would be a huge amount now, but it was a huge amount then when the population was much less. And, I wish I could tell you that hate groups are dwindling, right? If you want to look at the disgusting branch outgrowth that has this racist trunk as part of its history, you can look at all of the hate groups which are burgeoning. The Southern Poverty Law Center does good work on this. The number of hate groups has decreased, okay? But the membership of them is quite strong. Hate groups and the views of them have become mainstreamed. They've come out of the woodwork. And especially as a result, just to go back to the sort of free speech unit here briefly, as a result of propaganda by, people like Tucker Carlson, for example, on Fox News, who has mainstreamed and made it okay to talk about the so-called Great Replacement Theory, which is this racist idea that there's a plot on the left to replace white people with minorities, and like it's this active policy that's being carried out. Okay. The Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, hate groups that are of the lineage of the KKK, they were largely responsible for the January 6th coup attempt. 15 members of the Proud Boys have been convicted. And again, I invite you to watch those hearings to learn, how much these white nationalist hate groups coordinated those attacks. So hate is on the rise, unfortunately. It is not going away. And there's a clear continuity between the just disgusting things which you need to learn about. And like I said, look at that Equal Justice Initiative pamphlet and the disgusting things that are happening right now. It is not going away. Okay. So what are we going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? This is where, the next piece where things get a little more controversial because it's hard to know exactly how to deal with this problem. And this relates to forms of affirmative action. Let me say the thing that is not, I think, controversial, because there's two different forms of weak or affirmative action. There's weak and then there's strong. What I think is not controversial is weak affirmative action. Weak affirmative action just says, hey, if we have institutions that make it so that there is not a level playing field, for example, the housing practices, right, that were written into like the FHA that I was talking about, we should remove those, right? We should remove any institutions that do not allow for a level playing field, okay? And if there are practices which are explicitly racist, for example, our criminal justice system, for example, the voting rights things that are going, the voting restrictions and the polling places. Weak affirmative action said we should get rid of those. So we should definitely reinstitute the Voting Rights Act and reverse the decision of the partisan Supreme Court, which got rid of that pre-clearance, for example. We should definitely look into predatory lending practices and not allow predatory lending practices, and so on and so forth. I hope that that's uncontroversial. Okay, so that's weak affirmative action. Strong affirmative action is different. This is where you take active measures to do something to level the playing field. So you don't just remove barriers that create the unlevel playing field, and so that it can allow it to level itself naturally. You take active measures to promote a level playing field. So this is things like, hiring practices, where you have so-called affirmative action, like quotas, for example, which say that you need so many black and brown folks to be hired for a certain position. You need, in education, you need an admissions process that includes those kinds of quotas, right? That's strong affirmative action. Reparations, where you pay black people, you give them a sort of universal basic income, let's say, to all people of color as a way of righting the wrong and leveling the playing field, right? It's important to realize that that initial thing that I talked about, whereby it was said that black people needed to be given property, that was strong affirmative action. So it was sort of obvious at the end of the Civil War that we needed to do it. Okay, and it was undermined, like I said, by Andrew Johnson and the Supreme Court and others, right? So the question is now, though, is it right? Is now the time for it? Strong affirmative action. I don't know the answer to that, and I want you to, think about it. And you can agree that strong affirmative action of some form should be taken, but then the next question is, well, what exactly should it be? That's a difficult question too. Okay, so I leave that to you. I leave that to you to figure out. Maybe you don't think strong affirmative action should be given at all. Maybe, it would be great if we just did the bare minimum and got rid of the discriminatory practices I mentioned. That would be great. We could at least start there, okay? Because we need to do that in ways I've talked about. But after that, do we need to do anything else? Do we need to actively promote a level playing field in the way that I've talked about, I leave that to you to decide. Okay? And now we can sort of finish by, discussing Yancey's. I love that piece because I hope it pissed some of you off. And it was deliberately provocative. He was trolling you. And I think it was useful because it promotes basically everything I've been trying to say in this class. Okay? And it relates to what you're going to do after you've learned, I'm assuming you have, some things. What are you going to do about it? All right, so let's get into it. So he uses the word racism, but he's clearly talking about white privilege. And so you can, there's work and it's a semantic question about the difference between white privilege and racism. And according to common usage, they are different, right? Racism would be something more overt, whereas white privilege would be something that's passive. So he uses the word racism, but you can think of it as what is more commonly called white privilege, right? And he talks about it. The rubber hits the road in the middle of the article when he talks about any sort of advantage that you enjoy just by virtue of being white. If you walk down the street, for example, you don't get harassed by the police, let's say, just by virtue of being white. There's this expression, driving while black. Well, that doesn't happen to you if you're white. And it's, again, you can deny the reality, but it's been shown that it does happen. Okay? You don't get subjected to predatory lending practices. You don't have to worry about that if you're white. Okay? Everything else, we could go on and on and on. Just go through everything I've been saying about the institutions in question and realize that by virtue of being white, you are not subjected to those same things. And that is the reality. Okay? That is part of the sort of outgrowth that I keep talking about, the branch that we are now on. You are sitting on that branch, so to speak, benefiting from it if you are white. So that's what white privilege that's what white privilege is. And now what he said is, if you benefit from it and you don't do anything to address institutionalized racism, then you are complicit in institutionalized racism. And I think there's something to be said about that. Now he calls you racist, and people can get hung up on whether or not you fit into that particular box. But the idea is, regardless of the word you want to use, if you benefit from white privilege and you do nothing to address institutionalized racism, then you are obviously part of the problem, right? And so this is just a nice way of ending the class, because the whole point of this class, right, was for you to develop your own point of view and to think about it logically so that you do something. Okay, so that you do something. You're taking a class on ethics. Okay? The class is about how you should live your life. If you take this class on how you should live your life and you do nothing with it, then ask yourself why you are in college, why you are getting an education. If you are only doing this class just for the grade and you will not learn anything else from it, right, then that's an obvious shame. And you're missing out on an opportunity to use this in a way that matters. Okay? So that's what the class is about. You changing your behavior. I do not want you to think that I'm telling you you should change the world. That's not what I'm asking. But I am asking you to change yourself. Change yourself. Look in at who you are. Look at the kind of person that you are and ask yourself whether being ethical, whether addressing these things matters to you. Now, the odd sociopath in here notwithstanding, I'm going to assume that most of you, all of you, when you look in, you do think that ethics matters to you. Okay? And so Yancey's point is, if you think that ethics matters to you, then why don't you change your behavior? His point is, you're doing it out of a kind of cowardice. All right? You need what he would call love, and I would call courage. And, I would also call strength. You need to employ that. And you need to employ that to change yourself. not change the world, but to change yourself. Otherwise, you're just doing what everybody else is doing right now. Have you noticed? Oh, nothing's wrong. Oh, someone's going to fix all this stuff for me. No one's going to fix it for you. No one's going to fix it for you. All right? And so his point is, if you do nothing out of weakness and distraction, because you've been conditioned to take a class just for the grade, and you do not change yourself as a result, right? Then I think he's right. I think you are complicit in the problem. And the idea would be, instead of doing that, why don't you look inward, find out what kind of person you are by looking inward, and then operate accordingly from strength and love. Okay? And change your behavior as a result. I don't know what it is. I don't know what you'll do differently. You decide what that is. And you decide how you change your behavior based on what your point of view is. Okay? And I think institutionalized racism is a great example of that, because by addressing institutionalized racism in some way, shape, or form, you'll be addressing all of the other issues that we talked about, because institutionalized racism is the same kind of white patriarchy which is behind, for example, the rollback of women's rights that we talked about, which is behind, for example, the misuse of the word freedom that people use to say I'm free to do something that puts other people in danger, which is behind the Second Amendment. The white patriarchy is behind the misuse of the idea of free speech, which is used to spread information, which is killing thousands, if not millions, of people. All right, all of that is behind all of the issues that we've talked about. So if you address institutionalized racism, I think you get at the root of the problem. A separate question is what that has to do with capitalism, and I'm not going to get into that here. But racism and capitalism are very much linked because they both relate to exploitation. But I didn't really talk about that too much here. So that's a subject for another class, I suppose. All right, so that's all I wanted to say. Thanks to everybody who stuck around for these videos. I hope you benefited from them. And stay tuned for information about the remaining deadlines, and reach out to me if you have any questions. All right, take care.